Welcome to the Homelab Show, episode 105, Homelab Workstations. How you doing, Jay?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Typing one-handed is still less fun, but I can get my arm out of the sling a little bit so I can get my fingers by the keyboard and type. For those who want to know, I was in a motorcycle accident. Vlog episode 341. I give the details because no need to repeat them here. But nonetheless, Jay had an interesting topic idea of, we talk about the servers and the software a lot, but we never talk about what you're using to connect to those and interact with them. I mean, granted, sometimes, probably less and less anymore, you do plug a keyboard, maybe a mouse, but definitely a keyboard and monitor directly into a server to get it set up. But that's generally not your day-to-day interaction with it, unless it breaks and has a button stuck or something like that. Because me and Jay were late because he had to tell me about the button stuck story,
which is pretty hilarious, actually. Maybe I'll share that too. It was a funny story. We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. But we want to talk about the workstations we use. And by just sheer coincidence, I had, because of a project that's now finished, we have a pretty much unused at my office Mac M1 version, so a little bit the first generation Air. And I said, I wonder if I could use this as my workstation. I've been a Linux person for over 10 years on my desktop, and I'm not someone who's ever actually used a Mac, but it kind of made me think once I started using it that this is actually not a bad interface because I'd prefer it to be Linux, but I was shocked at how well it worked. And this kind of just spiraled into a what's a good workstation discussion. And we thought we wanted to share that with some of the different thoughts we have on there. And we can even go backwards in time because I did and look up because I know Jay reviewed like the Pine book. And there's a lot of people who build even Raspberry Pi workstations to interact with things. It also highlighted something I've been wanting to do, and why I didn't spend as much time with the Mac was I decided to build a jump box because I was like, oh, I'm used to managing all my keys in my very familiar Linux environment. This is a little bit trickier. So why don't I build a special box, a jump box, if you will, so I can just connect to each ones. And I think, isn't your jump box like a Raspberry Pi, Jay?
It was. I switched almost everything over from Raspberry Pi to Proxmox, not because I have anything against Raspberry Pi. It just kind of happened. Like I moved that first. I'm like, well, this is a lot faster. What's Kubernetes like on this? So I spun up the cluster, and then next thing I know, I just moved off a Raspberry Pi unintentionally. But once I saw how much faster it was, but it currently is a VM on the stack. Now I might move it back to a Pi because there's something novel about having your jump box outside of everything else in its own little contained thing. So that could revert back to the other direction.
I built mine inside of TrueNAS. And the reason for it was because, one, I wanted it in my studio, and I don't have a virtualization server here and don't really need one for anything. And TrueNAS has lots of memory, and it takes very, very little memory to run a jump box because it just needs to boot up and make sure all my SSH keys in there. But I went a step further to help protect my SSH keys, which we've done a whole episode on SSH keys as well. But one of the things that's important to me is that when it boots, it requires a password with Lux. So in order to boot it, that way, if anyone ever copied it, stole my NAS or whatever, they would not be able to actually boot this thing up because it would not have a password on it for them to start extracting the keys. So I've got the partition encrypted on there. Just one extra layer. The likelihood that someone's going to come in, take my NAS, and also be someone smart enough to know how to extract SSH keys is a pretty far reach. But hey, it's just a password. It stays running all the time, so it's not like I have to type it in very often.
Yeah, if you want to like go crazy, you could just get like a Raspberry Pi and then power it via USB-C, which is of course the only way to power it, but plug it into your computer to power it, plus have a local SSH connection to the Pi over USB. And then have it, you could have Tailscale or something to have an IP. You could have your jump box in your pocket, and nobody can hack it if it's not even plugged in. If it's just in your pocket, plug it into your computer while you use it, and then disconnect when you're done. A little involved, but it is something. Someone asked, "What is a jump box?" I should probably mention what that is first. In our chat room, someone asked that.
Yeah.
So it's also known as a bastion host, where you have it's your entry point into your network. It needs to be the most secure device of all. So basically, SSH passphrase, like a key, a physical hardware key added on top of it with some other checks and balances. You really have to lock this one down. And the idea is it's your way into the network. It could be a VPN, it could be something else, but generally speaking, Bastion host, jump box are the same thing. I don't really use mine as a jump box, so I don't really think I think I should probably stop calling it that because I'm always home. I don't need to like access my network. I live where my network is, so I don't really connect inwards. I don't have my jump box, so to speak, externally available at all. It's internal only. So what I use it for is more of a TMUX server where I want one device where all my terminal sessions are. So if I reboot my laptop, my desktop, it doesn't matter. I don't lose anything because the sessions are all on that. And I just use Mosh to reconnect. Mosh is a, kind of like a wrapper on top of SSH that'll reinstate your connection. For example, if you take your laptop out of the house, you were connected to a server, you come back, it'll reconnect you automatically as long as you keep the window open. So I use that too. So it's more or less a central terminal work server, I guess you could call it. And there's something novel about keeping that off your computer because then your computer, you don't care about rebooting as much because you don't have to worry about losing a work session. The other side of this, though, is it doesn't help with video editing, unfortunately. You can't, I mean, you can, but it becomes way more expensive to have a central box for editing video. So there's a limit to everything.
Yes. And because we're mostly doing things in SSH, that's why it kind of works for us. I'm just using TMUX on mine. So I
Mhm.
will start my sessions with TMUX. And if my laptop gets disconnected or I change my locations, I can just reattach that TMUX session. If I'm rebuilding something or have something being monitored, it's pretty easy. We also have Homelab Show episode 29 is where we dive into Bastion servers or jump box servers as a topic. We talk about all the different ways you can run it. So we've actually covered this pretty well before. If you want to drive back a little bit in history and listen to episode 29, hard to believe that was 70 something, 70 episodes ago now.
I forgot we did it. Like it's getting to a point where I wonder, and I think
I
this
did
has
too. That's
happened
why I
where we're
looked.
like, are we like we're gonna cover this? We've already done it, and then we're like far enough along. But it's been a long time. We should go back and update, which I think we'll regularly, revisit older topics. But yeah, we did cover it. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely, it kind of saves that. But let's get back over to the workstations and talk about choices there.
Yep.
And the first challenge I kind of ran into, and I think a lot of other people do, is you start looking for, and I'm, as I said, I'm a big open source advocate, but I have the MacBook, so I wanted to try the MacBook Air,
Mhm.
and I don't. I would have been the person to make I have been the person I should say to make plenty of jokes at the expense of Apple and Mac and making fun of people who use them. And then I found out Jay was a user, and I said, "Oh man, I can't make fun of Jay for it, can I though?" But
Well, you probably can because I don't use it as much. I mean, it's kind of like I like it, but I don't love it, if that makes sense. There's a lot to like on Mac, but when it comes to like my productivity, GNOME just rules everything for me.
yes,
And we might as well start with Mac because I kind of feel like we're already talking. I mean, we are already
it's
talking about it,
it
but
is a
we may
good
as well.
choice.
Yeah.
The MacBook M1, we'll just say this right here. I was wrong about any assumptions I had about it. The battery life on it I haven't charged it since Monday. We'll just say that. It's now
Right.
Wednesday, and I pulled it off the charger Monday, and I've used it for my usual usage is going to be sending emails, replying to more emails, discussions on Slack with business things I'm working on, and I'll take some notes and things like that I may be doing for a video. But it's kind of like it's not like I'm sitting here using it all day. But you're talking about a small laptop with a nice keyboard, good tracking that you want to use to do things like, well, I did update a few SSH in. I had the new version of Zen Orchestra's out. So I was like, oh, cool. I'm going to go build new versions of this. And I have several servers. So I was updating them and things like that. So it's more mundane tasks where it may as well be called a dumb terminal. So it's not like I need the power at the workstation. And this
Right.
is probably true for a lot of people in the home lab is if you're just going to go, hey, I just want to log into these other servers, these other devices, update my NAS, maybe make some changes. You don't need a lot of horsepower on that side. And that's where it gets my first challenge was trying to find something because there are some really nice, light, thin laptops, but they have such heavy duty processors in them that's just so not needed. It's going to, even the Mac M1 only has 8 gigs of RAM. I think that makes it a 3 or 4 year old laptop because the M2's out now. And it still has incredible battery life, doesn't have much power, but it really is not a bad choice because, man, once I SSH into my jump box, from there, I got to all the things I need to get to. I'm able to manage all the servers. You can still use things like proxy chains and stuff like that, which I've done videos. If you look up, I've got videos on proxy chains. That one might need to be updated because that's a fun way to pivot through networks. But
Right.
for all the things I need to get to, it actually works really well. And I didn't want to like it this much after I started using it, but that keyboard's nice and it just makes a nice interface for being able to talk to all my servers and just kind of, you know, I had to get a few, we'll just say, videos that we wanted to watch, all completely legal ones, and stream them,
Right.
to get them from where they are until you get them into your MB server so you could stream them to the TV. That's easier to manipulate on a little laptop, moving some files around. It just makes it really easy for that. I actually think it's a pretty good choice that you can find for some reasonable prices on there.
Yeah, I do agree. I think the hardware, a lot of people will argue that Mac is more expensive, which is kind of true. But that argument always breaks down when you compare like to like. Like you have to understand the difference between PC and Mac is PC, you have several different what do I want to call this, like audiences, where you have like the, average users that just don't care. You have the people that care a lot and they're just power users and everything in between. Sometimes it just makes sense to have something simple for an audience. And I think for the Mac, it fits a lot of that, but, it depends on your use cases and everything. I have, um, just to kinda get this out of the way, I'm a technologist. Yes, Linux is number 1, but I
Yeah.
love technology. So, to be well-versed in technology, what I think is required is to have a sample device of every type, right? So, I have, a Windows computer somewhere in the house. If I need to it's a ThinkPad that I think it's like a T480 that has Windows 11 on it. So if I need to capture footage from Windows 11, I can do that. The Mac exists for anything. I kind of use it for my, oh my gosh, I got to really use a proprietary device. It's that device. So if I get one of those crummy websites that detect user agents or just make things hard, or the one-off things that require something proprietary, it's kind of like fine, I'll pull that out. But I like to have a sample device in every category just so I can stay up with what Apple's doing, what Microsoft is doing, and if there's a Chromebook in the house somewhere, iPads, you name it. But getting back to the Mac, for me, it's I like it, but I don't love it. There's a lot to like, and starting with the hardware, um, it is cheap. And getting back to my original point, people will say, "I could get a PC for $300. Why am I gonna, spend $1,300 on a Mac?" And then the reality is, if you're considering or if you're comparing PC and Mac, you have to compare like to like. You have to compare a business class computer to a MacBook because they are targeting the same audience. You can't compare a MacBook to a $300 computer from Walmart that'll last you 6 months. You just can't do that. Likewise, you also can't compare a more expensive Chromebook to a cheaper PC, or even a more expensive PC to a cheaper PC. So we have to keep the same argument. Now, if you look at what Dell and Lenovo are offering, and Apple as well, you're going to pay about $1,300 for that class of computer, or roundabout, give or take. It's about the same, but then it depends on the operating system, the platform, whether you want to be in that platform, and that's when it starts to really go into many different directions. On my end, I think the hardware is great. I just have issues with the operating system, and none of them are with macOS are like so huge that it stops me from using it. There's things that make me grumble. So for one thing, with my intense ADHD, bouncy icons and things flashing all around the screen are just not pleasant to me. Like I just cannot filter those things out. Like my brain can't tune out noises that I hear in the background. I also can't, stop looking at something that's blinking if Mac OS is wanting me to look at something. But worse, I would be typing in a terminal and then it takes me out of the terminal when there's alert on another workspace. There used to be a way to disable this in the command line. They call it auto swoosh, which is weird. And the command line trick used to work. It doesn't disable it anymore because my line of thinking is regardless of whether I'm on, which work mode I'm on. If I'm typing in a terminal, leave me alone, right? Or
Yeah.
even when I was writing a book, I tried what it was like. I couldn't even finish a single chapter on the MacBook because it kept taking me out of the document that I was writing in just to look at something else I didn't ask to look at. I didn't have any control. It said, "Oh, we're gonna just force you to stop and bring you over here. Those are the type of things that really drive me batty on Mac OS. And the other interesting thing I ran into most recent time I tried it was if you right click an icon on the I think they call it the what do they call it? The panel, the taskbar at the bottom, the dock. It's the dock. I almost didn't think of it. If you right click an icon and then choose show on all workspaces, it works sometimes. Sometimes it'll work for like, I don't know, some amount of time. And then like it's weird that Mac users don't seem to notice this. Like the show on all workspaces doesn't really work. At some point, it'll force you to look at it on a single workspace. And after 3 updates, they didn't even fix it. So it's like all these weird issues. None of them are too big, but if you take those out, it's fine. I mean, it's not, in my mind, a really amazing interface, but it's good enough. And I think for the average user or somebody who's not picky like me, is probably perfect. But for me, I just have all these things happening and it just drives me crazy. I'm like, I just want a simple, leave me alone, let me get my work done OS. And that is Linux. So that's why it continues to still be number one for me.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that we should probably mention next is if you're looking for some Linux laptops, let's just go right there, and we'll start at the premium side. And because we talked about the MacBook Air, which I
Right.
think is it's a reasonable price, and I'm still eyeing, and maybe I'll have to talk to Jay about this or come out and hang out with him for a little while. System 76 makes nice Linux laptops. Jay's
Right.
reviewed several of them. The quality's good. I'm also looking at Framework's got some new, I think they're Ryzen ones coming out that are the thinner, smaller ones. Framework is really nice, but there's definitely a price premium on any of the Linux laptops. And
Right.
it's a volume issue. There's not an easy way for those companies to move the volume that gets you those discounts. So you're kind of buying into, and I don't mind. Spend a little bit of extra money on a premium product. Uh, but it's just something that people should be aware of. If you look at the Lemur, the Oryx, and some of the models that they have, the build quality is really nice on them. Your reviews are pretty positive on all those you tested. Am I right, Jay?
Yeah, I don't, so the price premium, I don't know. There's a couple ways to look at this because when I compared specs, and one of them that I compared was the ThinkPad X1 Extreme, whatever one was the current model at the time, and this was a couple of years ago, against I think it was the Oryx Pro, if I'm not mistaken. When you compare like to like, for the most part, until you start peeling it away, it kind of looks like it's more expensive. But what I found is that System 76 usually has higher specs in at least one area. So, for example, the ThinkPad X1 Carbon ended up being no Extreme. Sorry, the ThinkPad X1 Extreme ended up being more expensive than the equivalent System 76 laptop with half of the GPU power. And at the time I looked at the Oryx Pro, no laptop that I was aware of even had that much horsepower for a GPU. So they usually go a little bit higher. One thing that I like to make people aware of before they go in any direction is whether you need accident protection warranty. Some of us are klutzes, right? We have accidents. It happens. Do you want to be out $1,300 if you accidentally drop it? Would you pay more money to have an accident protection warranty on it? I like to protect my investments, so I do that, and it's paid off as well. But if you're not a klutz, then it doesn't matter. But the problem is if you go with, for example, a ThinkPad, you can buy on-site, literally on-site repair warranties on these. You can't do that with System 76. The problem,
Right.
and I feel like they're the number one PC provider for me. However, it is a big problem for me, especially as a business, that if my laptop breaks, even if it's my fault, I can't get one quick. It's going to take a couple of weeks to replace it. I don't have a couple of weeks. On-site warranties are great because someone comes to you with the part and they fix it. Sure, you pay a premium for that if you have the budget for it. And if you're clumsy, you may as well. But with System 76, you don't get that choice. They don't even have accident protection warranties at all. So if that's you and that's something that you care about, then that would be a reason to go with, in my mind, ThinkPad over System 76, depending on what's important to you. But I just want to make that point clear before anyone just starts opening up their pocketbook.
Yeah, and I'm not gonna lie, from the business side of me, that's what we actually settle on as a company is everyone gets, the ThinkPads bought for them with the warranties. They're just a really solid system,
Yep.
and they're very Linux friendly. This is one of the reasons they get recommended so much because I've already had like, particularly because I didn't buy the XPS, I really wanted, and this is the laptop I'm probably gonna throw up for sale. It's a really nice Dell i7 laptop with an OLED screen. I bought it because I didn't want to admit I was probably could use some glasses. And it
Right.
just doesn't run Linux quite as well. But I've actually learned this is more of an Intel bug than it is a problem with the laptop running Linux. Is it doesn't it still uses a lot of power when it sleeps. There's a discussion going on with Level One Wendell on Twitter today, or whatever the hell Twitter's called today. But the a discussion about laptops still using power and not going into sleep properly, and doing it inside of Windows. And that was one of
Right.
the first annoyance. Second one is kind of bulky and heavy. And I said, okay, I want something light. That's why I moved over there. But the ThinkPad series kind of fits all the above, where it runs Linux well, no quirkiness. The screens are nice, they're lightweight, and this is something especially for the Homelab people who don't have bigger budgets. You can find these on the secondary market that are a few years old that still work really, really well. And picking these up on the refurb market's actually pretty easy to find them between Amazon and eBay. There's always some of the refurb ones for sale that are just a few years old, but work great. And of course, once they're a few years old, you can really confirm quite well. If you go over to like even Ubuntu, even if you're not going to run Ubuntu, if you go over to the Ubuntu compatibility site, and if it says compatible with Ubuntu, you can pretty much say it's going to work because it's more of a matter of the kernel. It's going to work with other distributions that you may want to run on there.
I agree. I think the Linux support side is probably really good to talk about, and I should have mentioned this before. One thing I always like to mention, I think it's been a while since I mentioned it on the podcast, so I'll mention it again for those that are new. Um, Linux has the best hardware support on the planet, but it's not 100%. Okay,
Right.
let's be honest. Nothing is 100%. There is not a single piece of hardware out there that's 100% compatible with anything. For example, you could buy a GPU dock right now; it doesn't work on your MacBook. If it's M1, they just don't allow that. So there's an example of something that's not working that you have to research. Sure, that's not Linux related, but my point is there's no such thing as 100% compatibility.
Right.
Now, if you want to run Linux, you either A, buy a computer that's born to run Linux, you don't have to worry about it, or B, you research the compatibility before you buy it. Don't buy a computer and then put Linux on it without researching it just because, you heard it's 100% compatible, which is untrue. And then, some people will think that Linux sucks just because they happen to buy it or try it on a computer that wasn't meant for. Because, I mean, think about it this way. Try running Windows on a Mac, not via a VM or anything on the metal. You'll find out real quick just how much compatibility is important and how it's not a separate issue here. My line of thinking is if you buy a computer and the sticker says certified for Windows, made for Windows, or whatever the heck they put on laptop stickers now, you forfeit your right to complain if it doesn't work on Linux, period. Like, this is something in the community that drives me crazy where someone will, just really just insult Linux. And I'm like, Linux never promised to work on that computer. So why did you
Mhm.
buy that computer if you didn't know it was going to work? So I always tell people, do your research first. Now, I'm not saying that in the community we won't help you, because we all want Linux to work on everything. So people in the community, if you approach them the right way, they might have solutions. They might tell you where to file a bug report if they think it's a bug. There's ways to get through this situation that I think is a proper channel. But just keep in mind that if you buy a computer and you want to run Linux, even if you're thinking about running Linux and you're not sure about it, then just research that first. And it's especially strange to me that somebody will buy a MacBook like an M1 that doesn't even have full Linux support on it. Like there's a Asahi Linux is working on it. I don't know what the compatibility is. It's not going to be a good experience yet because it's new, but I've seen people buy these to run Linux. I'm like, well,
They're
why'd you
probably
do
not.
that?
I
Right?
got. I like the hardware, but they're probably not the first choice if you're on Linux. They're a good
Right.
choice if you want a project, and that project is helping the Asahi Linux
That's
get.
exactly what I was about to mention. If you wanna be a developer and really help that project along, I encourage you to buy a MacBook if you have the time and the money to donate time, to that project and help them out. That's always a great thing to do. And doing things like that is what's really going to help Linux gain even more popularity. But as long as you approach it like, each platform has its own pros and cons and different hardware, and you buy according to what you want to run. As long as you always follow that rule, you'll be fine. The issue, though, I think a lot of home lab people have computers in their closet. So maybe someone might be trying to run Linux on something they just happen to have that they didn't buy for that purpose, that they want to repurpose. That's perfectly fine. You'll have mixed results maybe, but it's still perfectly fine. And it gives you an opportunity to troubleshoot that and learn it. So I think a lot of people in home lab are approaching this from, well, I already have the computer, so I didn't research compatibility because I never knew I was going to run Linux in the first place. But since I have it, can I do it? And one thing I find is a great way to do this is if you run even on a live image without installing it, you boot the computer and then you run lspci, and then you could find the hardware string for whatever piece of hardware isn't working. Google Linux and then that hardware string, you'll find your answer, even if it's a bug report. But I want to say at least 90% of the time I find everything I need to know just from doing that when it comes to compatibility.
Yeah, the other side, let's swing it by the other way now.
Mhm.
And I was pulling up the specs on my system because what if you wanted to build and you're going, I don't need a laptop. I don't leave my house. And even though Jay doesn't leave his house a lot, he does have some laptops. But
Recliner home lab edit, hacking is really great, by the way.
yeah, but building it when it comes to like a
Yeah.
workstation, this is another home lab option that you can consider. And I seen someone kind of mention this, but let's go all out. Like I have a nice system here, and it is a uh, Ryzen 9 with what model is this again? I had to pull it up and move the screen. Mine is it's okay. It's a couple years old now, but it's a Ryzen 9 3900X. I know there's some faster processors out today. It was pretty good when I bought it. 32 gigs of RAM. And one of the things you can do is VirtualBox. And I'm running this in Linux, VirtualBox, or you can put KVM in there. There's some other things you can do, but don't discount running how simple the simplicity of running VirtualBox is, because the UI is easy and it's simple to manage. But you can actually have one really beefy workstation and then run all your virtual machines in there, not have multiple machines. This is something you can definitely do. It can be your
Yep.
everything machine for all of your experimentation. And for a long time, and well, even now, sometimes especially if there's anything graphical I'm doing, I don't spin it up in my XCP&G server. I'll spin it up in VirtualBox because the compatibility is so good that I'll just pop something on there. If I want to look at another desktop, if I want to look at a different distribution, it's kind of nice to have and build a decent machine for that. Now, because I'm using like the Asus Aorus Ultra gaming board, it's all pretty standard stuff. The support for Linux for things like that is really good. It's
Mhm.
not challenging. Matter of fact, because of this studio setup I'm using for when I do my recording right now, this is my 1080 screen that I record on, but I also have an ultra wide over here, multi-monitor, all that works so well in Linux. Matter of fact, multi-monitor makes it handy because I have two keyboards and mice set up. So when I turn my chair the other way, I'm facing my big giant widescreen. But then when I'm facing the camera for my tutorials, I want a standard 1080. So I got two sets here. But I also, when people see me and it looks like I'm running Windows or recording that, that's just a virtual box. I pop open Windows, I set up something, test the theory, do a tutorial. I can load another distribution. Building your workstation still is pretty valid, and it's cost savings in some ways because you can build one really high end system and just do everything from there.
You can also buy small and upgrade. If you buy a motherboard, if you're on a super budget, buy a decent motherboard that has a lot of compatibility of CPU and memory and things like that, and just buy the bare minimums as long as you can, upgrade it. You're building it, you should be able to upgrade it. So buy a motherboard that has a lot of future use in there. I remember when I first started, I would buy like a very small amount of memory, like a starter CPU that was barely even usable, and then waiting a few paychecks later, I would buy faster, bigger memory, and then buy a better CPU, and then I would just keep kind of stepping it up, and it kind of worked out well for me back then. Also, I want to just point out, I did a video about the Nebula cases from System 76 recently that allow you to essentially build a Thelio, which is their brand of desktop computers, and um, that's actually what led to this topic, or one of the things, because it's something I was working on anyway. And I figured, yeah, we should probably talk about this. So I have a whole video about it. But the Nebula cases are unfortunately pricey. I'm just going to throw that out there. But they could literally probably stop a bullet No, these things are super strong. Now, I'm not saying anybody should shoot their computer, but and I'm not saying I know anything about bullets enough to know how much metal is required to stop one, but I'm pretty sure that as thick as that is and as heavy as they are on the
Like
inside,
armor
that it'll
plated.
probably be fine. But they have like the probably one of the best cooling that I've ever seen, and it even worked out strangely well. And this is another video I'm going to do. A Turing Pi 2 board, which is a ITX motherboard, lets you slot Raspberry Pi compute modules. They can share the same backplane, so it's essentially a multi-server server, I guess, blade server, but it's not quite the same thing. Raspberry Pi compute modules. The the way that the Thelio case is built, and this is hilarious in a great way, like you put on the shroud where all the air is directed, and it goes right over the compute modules, blowing air across all of them on the way out of the case. It's a coincidence, a very happy coincidence, but you have to take one of the trying to remember, like extend one of the fans because you can kind of on the inside of the shroud kind of move them around. You want to move them further apart, put them down along the compute modules, and you'll keep them cool too, which is pretty cool. I'll be doing a video about that at some point. But yeah, building your computer is great if you want to do that. It comes down to time and preference. If you want to micromanage your desktop, there's no better way than to build it because you can micromanage everything.
Yeah.
But if you want something turnkey, buy it.
And I'm glad
Because
someone suggested this
support is the thing too.
because one of the things you're using right now, I
Mhm.
believe in your editing system, you can get those cards. Now, this is something you'll have to do a little bit of reading on to
Mhm.
depending on how you want them set up. If you want the full performance and it's the number of PCI lanes and how you would bifurcate them, you have to look for motherboards that support this. But if you have a motherboard that supports proper PCI lanes and bifurcation, you can get a up to 4 NVMEs on a PCIe card. So you can build these workstations and still have really fast storage. Matter of fact, for some testing I was doing when I was building some XCP and G systems, but you can do this as well as any Linux workstation. I just set up MD80M RAID right on those devices. So I have my RAID built in. So I got my boot drive, I got a RAID array that's really fast, plenty of storage. Or maybe you want to just go all out and just make it one giant storage for all of your VMs and not even worry about redundancy because it's all for testing. This is another thing that's become a lot less expensive to do to have really high speed storage. And that can eliminate some of the other virtualization bottlenecks you may run into of some of the IO limitations of getting it over to your NAS. And it's definitely a fun way to play it. I've seen someone mention in there, and I think, don't you have at least one large NVMe extra in here, like an add-in card?
Yes, I have an 8 terabyte NVMe drive that I use as my cache drive for editing. And you may think that's a lot. It is. It is a lot of space. But when you work on a raw video project, I could fill that entire 8 terabyte NVMe with 3 video projects, just three, and sometimes two really large ones. Because when you are editing on compressed video, they just jump to a ginormous size. It's insane. So I thought, well, this is cool. I could just have all the cache on one drive, and it doesn't even matter. Um, my Thelio is getting the motherboard replaced right now because of some weird noise. It's a long story, but it's under warranty. So that's if anyone's wondering where the heck is that thing. I took of course I took the NVMe drive out of there because I didn't want them to accidentally. I'm not saying System 76 would ever miss a drive, but when you pay as much as I did for a NVMe, you're gonna take that out of there and make sure you retain that and put it in your
Yeah.
drawer and keep it safe because that's I don't think I'm gonna buy another one. Let's just say that.
Now let's swing it I think the final thing to cover is kind of swing it the other way. Is I brought up the Pine book. What do you think
Mhm.
of some of those? Because I got to admit, the idea of running like an ARM or Raspberry Pi, and I've seen some really neat DIY projects that allow you to kind of build a laptop, if you will, out of a Raspberry Pi. What do you think of some of those projects?
So the one issue about these types of computers, especially when you have ARM, is we don't really have a standard. We kind of do. We have Raspberry Pi Imager and these flashing utilities, but think about it like this: with a PC, you could put in a flash drive, you turn it on. There's a BIOS or UEFI screen that comes up, and you can hit a boot menu. We don't have that as a standard thing on ARM. Yes, you can do that on ARM. It is possible to have that same exact experience, but when you boot a Pinebook or a Raspberry Pi, a Pi 400, or any of these, it's going to expect you to have already flashed the storage. You have to do that externally. It's not terribly hard. You just have to follow the directions and how-tos. That's how you load a Linux distribution onto these. Obviously, the Pinebook would come with one. I don't know what it comes with today, but that's kind of the only challenging part. It might involve USB to access the eMMC in these laptops to flash the storage that way. Or in the case of the Pinebook, you could boot off of an SD card and then flash the eMMC right from a working session. We don't have UEFI as a standard here, but aside from that, the you're going to have lower performance on a Pinebook. It's not
That's the
going
thing that
to.
people
Yep,
I wanted to make sure you said that because
yep,
that is the one problem people really run into. And I love watching the projects. I've seen them on Hackaday, Build Your Own Laptop, and some really cool projects around that as a topic. But the moment you open up a browser, and that pretty much is what so much of us have to do. There's so much cool things that they can now render with the latest HTML5. I love how the UI works and different
yep,
things. It's like, wow, there's so much power to think I'm manipulating entire virtual machine infrastructures all with this web interface. But if you have a slow processor, you'll even watch the processor
yep.
really get chewed up. That was actually what I really had to test on the Mac M1 was how does it render these pages? Does it choke? Because that is the thing. I need to be able to use these tools, which load a lot into the browser, which is essentially its own pretty extensible operating system into itself. You can, of course, play Doom, but I'm impressed with some of the other games you can play in here. It's way beyond the early days of Flash, but that all means it's got to be processed. And to further hamper that
Yep.
processing, the sandboxing that's done by modern browsers, whether it's Firefox, Chromium based ones, they are segmenting things more and more for security reasons, which is wonderful. That comes at the expense, though, of not running all the processes in a way that is quite as efficient. There's always trade-offs when you start sandboxing sounds great. And then when you do it, you're like, oh, wait, we just lost some of our efficiencies because we don't want to share caching between here. We don't want to share any of these resources. So we got to create them all in a series of spawned silos that go all the way down, which costs more memory and can cost more CPU time. So it's one of the things you really have to be aware of with the slower or even older computers, in especially the ARM and Raspberry Pi based ones. That's an immediate challenge you're going to be acutely aware of when you try to open up modern websites.
So I think it's worth to mention, what's the difference between like an M1 and ARM and
Yeah.
anywhere else? Because on an M1, I mean, you on the right one, you can edit video like pretty much just as well as a PC with a dedicated GPU. And you say you could run some games. You could literally run Final Fantasy 14 on an M1. Okay, I'm not kidding. And some of the games that I've seen people play on this, just running it through their Rosetta, it works very well. Now, why is that though? Why is it that ARM is good when you're on a MacBook, but it's slow as dirt when you're on a Pi 400 or a Pinebook? And the thing to understand is that with ARM, you have a reduced instruction set. That's part of the name. So you have a programmer has to write more code to do the same thing on an ARM processor, but an ARM processor is more efficient. It does have to work harder, but with Apple and the M1, they've created extensive tooling and essentially created instruction sets on a reduced instruction set and put these things in the M1 to make it perform well. Where it's like, oh, you're editing video. Well, I have that codec built right into the CPU because they're going to have that built right in. So the things that people use are built in. Then you have, extensive work being done on Rosetta that is helping to translate the API calls or whatever. Um, so essentially, you have a lot of work around this. Now, when you don't have that big layer on top of ARM and you just have ARM and you're running a Linux distribution that wasn't necessarily built with ARM first, it was compiled for ARM. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You're going to have additional overhead. That's just the way that it is. I hope that we get to a certain point where we could put that same layer of attention to detail on top of ARM. And I think we'll get there. But right now, Apple is doing it better. It's just the truth.
Yeah.
It is the way it is. So that's why with Apple, you can have your cake and eat it too. With ARM, you have to do some hacking. But I say ARM, but I meant like ARM, that's not Apple. But you could get a little clever though, because you could run a like a virtual machine with a bunch of cores, for example, and install Firefox, Google Chrome, whatever you use on there, and then use X2Go to forward the application to your Pinebook, to your Raspberry Pi, and essentially you could have like 32 gigs of RAM worth of browsing on a machine that has just 8 gigs of RAM, because all of that is being sent over to the server, which can give you that. It's not going to be as fast. You're not going to be able to do like, voice chat over the browser. That'll still lag. But you could essentially just have your apps on another server and use X2Go to forward them to your, lower powered machine, your Pinebook, whatever, even your phone. And all of a sudden, that 4 or 8 gig RAM limit isn't really a problem for you anymore, because you could just totally work right around it. So I kind of think with ARM as home labbers, we kind of have this opportunity to let our oppositional side come out. Oh yeah, I'm not going to just accept it as is. I'm going to just make this way more complicated than it needs to be, but it's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
That's exactly how we do it. And I think there's a great opportunity. Now, I do love the Pinebook. It's great. I haven't used mine in a long time. I probably should take that out and, run updates on it. It's been a long time. But I do have a lot of love for those. You just have to really understand that it's not going to be, sure, they're better than computers were, at some point in the past. Like if I brought a Raspberry Pi back in time to when I just started out, it would be like a supercomputer compared to what we had back then. But with the reduced instruction set, that overhead just kind of limits that a little bit. But I think from here, it's just going to get way better.
And you mentioned X2Go. Someone asked in the very beginning about a good VDI solution. I think that's probably, and it's, I'm not going to say it's great. I'm not going to say it's going to
No.
solve all your problems, but this is one thing you could do, is where you essentially are just using, let's say something as low powered as a Pinebook, but you're connecting with X2Go, and you have this monster of a server you built. That is another way to do it. Essentially, you're going back to, as someone likes to point it out, we're going backwards. You're going back to dumb terminals, which actually you're not. You are in some ways, though, just leveraging the power you have and using it more efficiently. And it's not really dumb terminal, but in some way it is, because
Right.
obviously the computer can do more. But if you move all of that rendering over there, there's even other tools out there that can bring the whole desktop managed inside of a browser. When you do something like that, once again, all you have to do is have a machine fast enough to bring that data to it as a display and connect to those other servers. That can be through, and Ubuntu does this, and I think they do it okay. It's not something I really use. Ubuntu's supports, and maybe Pop! OS does too, RDP protocol, as in it actually acts as an RDP server you can enable. It's not something I've done much testing with, but I have done videos on X2Go. I don't use it all the time, but it's pretty neat. I think Jay had tried it for rendering, and me and Jay came to the same conclusion. The idea is cool, but it is a little buggy for actually rendering, like to connect to a fast server to render our video. It's not quite good enough for that. For day-to-day tasks, I think it works, but rendering video, I remember it was a fail for me, and I think you tried it too, didn't you?
Yeah, it was actually a success. It wasn't that was the failure. It was Caden Live being a buggy mess that could
Oh,
barely
okay.
be running 5 minutes, let alone to render a video. It was fine for 1080p, but as soon as I went to 4K, and then even at 1080p, it started crashing. And my last draw was when I had a timeline that was perfect, and perfect enough. And I played it back on the timeline. It was great. And then I render it, and all the scenes are in a completely random order, not in the order they were in the timeline. Caden Live is just the buggiest piece of software I've ever used in my life. That was the reason why I think it failed, but it worked well when it worked. The idea
Mm,
worked because I would have syncing the directory where all my video file assets were, with the same path on both my local workstation and the server. So the Caden Live project file wouldn't have any problem with where things were. It would just find things with the same paths. So I would edit it on my computer, but I wouldn't render it. I would save the file, close out of Caden Live. All my files, including the project file, would sync over there. Then I just open up an X2Go window and bring up Caden Live, open the project, hit the render button. And I had like 64 gigs of RAM dedicated to this when I didn't even have a single machine that had 64 gigs of RAM.
mhm.
So I would hit the button, I would just hear the server, just all the fans, because I had everything cranked to the max. The server would just roar, and like the fans were going crazy, almost like you were doing a firmware update, but it was just rendering a video. And because it was synced via sync thing, I would render the video right into that same folder. It would sync back to my computer, and I would upload it. The problem is keeping Caden Live running, to do this. And to add insult to injury, even with 64 gigs of RAM, it could take 3 hours to render one video because it didn't do GPU rendering. So, but it did work well in the sense that my computer wasn't tied up. The issue
Yeah.
was when Caden Live is rendering, you can't use your computer for anything else. You're done. You just walk away from it. I didn't want my computer tied up by this anymore. So that was definitely a fun project, but I think it's Caden Live's bugginess that ultimately caused it to fail.
Yeah. VDI solutions, I don't really see too many people pushing for them. And the reason why is because web applications are kind of replacing that problem. That's kind of solving the problem is people go, oh, anytime I see someone using it, and for example, and of course, also for example, Citrix has a really popular VDI solution that always seems to have another popular bug because it's public facing. But the only people not the only, but there's a lot of the legacy systems is almost always where I see that in use. So that's if someone's going to fix the system, they don't go, well, let's write a better VDI to get these applications. They go, no, we're just going to use a web-based application because it's a better delivery method than trying to virtualize a desktop and send it across and pipe like all the settings of a desktop and stream the video over there versus, hey, we're just going to load a static web page and then it doesn't do anything until it submits more data interactively. So that's pretty much why I wouldn't predict the future is going to be bright for VDI. It's one of those, it
Right.
supports legacy applications. And it's not going away anytime soon because there's no shortage of legacy applications in the enterprise that aren't getting rewritten anytime soon. But eventually and slowly we will see these things unravel. And with a lot of vulnerabilities, that always pushes people going, this thing's kind of getting hacked a lot. I guess we should probably look at a better way of doing this. So hopefully
Right.
I'm happy to see
Yeah.
those things go away, actually.
But there actually is potentially a VDI solution for Linux that doesn't. I don't think we've ever talked about it before. I haven't finished looking at it, so I'm not going to say this is an endorsement. I've begun looking at it, and they might become a sponsor. I don't know yet. I have to like it first before I can
Okay.
recommend it to anyone else. But so take this with a grain of salt until I, maybe come out with an official recommendation. If they become a sponsor, that means I like it. It's called Chasm with a K.
Yes. Chasm's reached out to me as well.
Yep. And I looked at it. It is very novel. It's like you could run it in your home lab there, so you could basically run it, yourself if you want, which is going to be a win, I think, for a lot of people that they don't want to run everything somewhere else. So you can run this locally, and I've done it. And essentially, what it'll do is, if you want a Ubuntu desktop, it actually spins up a container of an Ubuntu desktop that you could then use within your browser. So I would at least give it a trial and see if this is something that you like, because I think that might be my potential contender for this type of thing. We'll know, because if this works out and I like it, I might do a tutorial on it, and there'll be some ad reads or something if it works out well. But I put my sponsors through hell sometimes because it could be 2 months of evaluation before I actually agree to have them on. So they're being very patient. They're happy to be patient. So that's a pretty good sign. I guess we'll see. But if you want to try it as Chasm, at least give the website a shot. Again, it's Chasm with a K.
Yeah. Chasm with a K.
Yep.
I've seen people ask this. I'm just going to mention this before we end this podcast. Someone says, can we get rid of the thing on the live stream that shows the hearts? I have no idea how to get rid of it. Probably some custom CSS will get rid of it, but there's not an on and off option that I can see inside of here. So
Actually, just use uBlock origin, right click and say block element, and you're done.
Oh, that's true. I could probably
Yeah.
block that as an
Assuming it
alt.
doesn't, link to anything else, it could backfire. You have to play
Yeah,
around
well,
with
I'm
it.
not going
Usually
to do
there's
that
a
then.
right click option with uBlock origin.
Yeah.
But that is a little distracting. This is like an example of my ADHD. Like if I'm looking at my recording monitor and I can't stop looking at the heart, like I'm not looking at any text. It's like I can't unsee the hearts and all those things going all
Yep.
over the screen. I'm trying to look at the text. So focus interruptions are bad, developers. Please understand this. A
Yeah, I
lot
don't.
of people,
It showed up
especially
on
if
the live
you're,
streams, and here it is.
could you imagine, someone on the autistic spectrum, for example, will especially hate this. And I feel like people don't really take these things in mind when they create things, whether you have ADHD or, you're on the spectrum or you're not, and you just actually legitimately hate this stuff, then, it's like the joke you made a long time ago, that comic strip, like putting QR codes on all the things. I can't remember what it was.
No, yeah.
About the management for a software project. It kind
Yep,
of
yep.
seems like these fluttery moving things all over the screen. Please don't. Please
Please
stop it,
don't.
people. Please don't do that.
Yeah. And you are correct. Someone said Network Chuck likes Chasm. Well, this is the thing. Network Chuck also did a sponsored video with Chasm. So this is we're always very clear that Chasm, if they reach out to one person on YouTube, they usually reach out to numerous people on YouTube in this similar category. So
Right.
yes, Network Chuck has done a video and they've reached out to us. Me and Jay are just very careful before we say yes to things because we
Right.
are professional technologists who have worked in this field for a very long time at a professional level. So we are very careful at which sponsors we take, and we don't want to ever steer people the wrong way of what we recommend. I think it's a neat tool, and feel free, it's open source. Feel free to try it yourself and make your own assessment. But me and Jay's professional opinion comes from our long time consulting and working as
Yeah.
architects and designing these systems for many years as sysadmins.
It's kind of funny when this is the first time I've ever seen anyone say chasm in the chat room. So when I looked at the comment, I thought it said Network Chuck likes corn. And I'm like,
Oh,
wow, he's got good music taste. I
oh
agree
yeah,
with
yeah.
that. And then I realized they're talking about chasm, because my brain, like if you look at the word chasm from a distance, it almost kind of looks that way, especially if you're already a fan. That's pretty funny. But yeah, I didn't even know he did anything on chasm.
I
That's
seen he
interesting.
did one, and I think that would that was sent out because they'll say, "Hey, we sponsored." The sponsors will reach out to us like that. Like I said, me and Jay are very careful, and we always
Yep.
clearly mark anything that is sponsored content. And we are always like to. We just want to be very, very honest with all of you all the time and share our experience, and hopefully get all of you more into home labbing. But I think that's all we have for today.
Yeah, I think the only thing I want to mention is just a shameless request. If there just so happens to be anybody associated with the framework laptop project that just moseyed on into the chat room, you never know. Sometimes
Oh yeah.
we have stars in there. If you want to just send some units out to Tom and I
Oh
to take a
yeah.
look at, I would totally be okay with that. I
I'm
would not
fine with
be
it.
angry at all.
My
Not at
address
all.
is on my website. If you wanted to
Yep.
send me two, I'll drop one off at Jay's.
Yep, there we go. We'd be more than happy to do an extensive review on it. That offer's on the table. Get it into the studio. I don't care if you ship it, send it via like some crazy pterodactyl that just drops packages everywhere. I don't even care. Get it over here. I'll review it.
Yep. All right. Yep. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
See you around.